Claire Bennett had always believed in the power of stories. As a part-time library assistant, books were not just her job, they were her escape. They offered her the warmth she never had growing up in foster care, a world where love was unconditional and families always found their way back to each other. But life was not a fairy tale, and she knew that better than anyone. She had learned early on that kindness often went unnoticed. People were too busy with their own lives to care about someone like her, a struggling woman barely making ends meet. Between her job at the library and babysitting for extra cash, Claire worked tirelessly just to afford rent and put food on the table. Despite it all, she never complained. If she had learned anything from her past, it was that self-pity never solved anything. It was a rainy afternoon when she first saw him. The little boy sat near the window of the library, his small frame hunched over a book that rested on his lap. He was alone, his wheelchair positioned just slightly out of reach of the shelf. His face was half hidden behind the cover of a fairy tale book, but Claire noticed the sadness in his posture, the loneliness in his stillness. She continued reshelving books, but she could not stop glancing at him. Minutes passed, and she saw him struggling to reach for another book on a higher shelf. His small hand stretched upward, but no matter how much he tried, it was just beyond his grasp. The sight made something tighten in Claire's chest. Without a second thought, she walked over. "Need some help?" she asked gently. The boy startled slightly and turned to look at her. His eyes were strikingly blue, too much like a sky right before a storm. For a second, he just stared at her, as if he was not used to people noticing him. Claire gave him a small smile before pulling the book from the shelf and placing it in his hands. "There you go." He hesitated before looking down at the book. His fingers traced the title, The Brave Knight and the Starlit Queen. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I like this one." "It's a great story," Claire said, crouching to meet his eye level. "Have you read it before?" The boy nodded. "A long time ago." She could see the way he held onto the book like it was something precious. "Would you like me to read it to you?" she asked. His head snapped up, his blue eyes wide with surprise. "I mean if you want," she added quickly, not wanting to make him uncomfortable. There was a pause, a long one. Then, slowly he nodded. Claire smiled, pulling out a chair next to him. She opened the book and began reading, her voice soft but animated. The boy listened intently, his eyes lighting up as the story unfolded. When she did different voices for the characters, he let out a small laugh. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. She did not realize someone was watching. The security camera near the entrance caught everything. The moment she helped the boy, the way she read to him, and most importantly, the way he laughed. That night, in a penthouse office overlooking the city, Ryan Dalton replayed the footage. At first, he did not think much of it. Just another kind stranger. His son, Noah, had always been drawn to books, and it was not unusual for people to show him sympathy. But something about the way the woman interacted with Noah felt different. She was not just being polite. She was engaged, truly present. Ryan leaned back in his chair, watching the screen as the woman smiled at his son. He did not know who she was, but he knew one thing. Noah had not laughed like that in a long time. The next day, Claire returned to the library as she always did. But something was different. As she made her way to the children's section, she found the same little boy sitting in the exact spot he had been in the day before. He was waiting. Claire hesitated, not sure if she should approach him again. But then Noah turned his head and saw her. "Can you read to me again?" he asked. The words were so simple, but they held a weight she could not ignore. Claire nodded. "Of course." And just like that, a routine began. Every afternoon, Noah would come to the library and wait for her. They read books together, talked about stories, and soon he started sharing things about himself. He told her about the books he used to read with his mother before she passed away. He told her about his favorite adventures, the way he wished he could run like the knights in the stories. Claire listened, never pitying him, never treating him differently. And Noah noticed. He had spent so long feeling invisible, like people only saw his wheelchair and not him. But with Claire, he felt like any other child. As the days passed, Claire grew more attached to him. She had never had a family, never known what it was like to be needed. But Noah, He made her feel like she belonged. What she did not know was that her presence in Noah's life was not going unnoticed. Ryan Dalton had never been a man who paid attention to strangers. His life revolved around his company, his meetings, his business empire. After his wife's passing, he had thrown himself into work, believing that keeping himself busy would keep the loneliness away. But now, every evening, he found himself watching the security footage of the library. Watching her. The way Claire smiled at Noah, the way she spoke to him, the way she never looked at him with pity or forced kindness. It made Ryan feel something he had not felt in years. Curiosity. He picked up his phone and called his head of security. Find out everything about the woman reading to my son. The next morning, Claire was restocking books when she felt a presence near her. When she turned around, she was met with the intense gaze of a tall, sharply dressed man. For a moment, she was taken aback. He had an air of authority, the kind that made people listen without question. But his eyes, piercing and unreadable, made her uneasy. You're the one who's been reading to my son, he said, his voice cool and controlled. Claire blinked. His son? Realization hit her like a freight train. Ryan Dalton, billionaire media mogul. And she had been reading to his child. She swallowed hard. Before she could finish, he cut her off. Why? The question caught her off guard. Why? She repeated. Ryan's gaze never wavered. What do you want out of this? She frowned, feeling a hint of irritation. I don't want anything, she said honestly. I just like reading to him. There was a pause. A long, calculating silence. Then, to her surprise, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Ryan's face. Interesting. And with that, he turned and walked away. Claire let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Claire never imagined that stopping by the library each afternoon would become the best part of her day. But with each passing visit, it was no longer just about reading to Noah. It became something more. A friendship, a bond neither of them had expected. Each day, she arrived with a new book, a new story to tell. Sometimes they read about knights and dragons. Other times about pirates and treasure hunts. But today was different. Today, she had brought nothing but a piece of paper. Noah eyed it curiously as she folded it with practiced ease. What are you doing? He asked. Claire smiled as she creased the edges. Teaching you how to make a boat. A boat? His eyebrows scrunched in confusion. She nodded. A paper boat. One that can sail across any storm, any sea. Noah hesitated but watched closely as she finished folding the small vessel. When she handed it to him, he held it carefully, almost as if it were something fragile. You know, Claire said, leaning closer, every great hero starts small. Maybe one day, you'll be a captain, sailing across the world. Noah let out a small laugh. I can't even walk. She shook her head. That does not mean you cannot be a hero. He was silent for a moment, staring at the boat in his hands. Then, softly, he said, Do you really think so? Claire met his gaze. I know so. Something in Noah's eyes shifted that day. What Claire did not realize was that someone else was watching. Ryan Dalton had always kept a distance from his son. It was not intentional. At least, that was what he told himself. His company, his business empire, it all demanded so much of his time. And after his wife passed, he did not know how to connect with Noah anymore. But something was different now. Noah was smiling more, laughing, and for the first time in years, he asked to go outside. Ryan's assistant had noticed it too. Sir, your son has been asking to visit the park lately. Ryan frowned at the statement. Noah never asked for anything. He also keeps talking about a woman named Claire, his assistant added. Ryan's grip on his pen tightened. Claire? Yes, sir. We reviewed security footage, and it seems she has been spending time with Noah at the library. Ryan exhaled slowly, his mind processing the information. Someone was making his son happy. And it was not because of money, not because of status. That was new. Find out everything about her, he ordered. Claire had just finished her shift at the library when she received the unexpected invitation. It was delivered in an expensive envelope with gold embossing. She had never seen anything so elegant in her life. At first, she thought it was some mistake, Why would she, of all people, receive something like this? But when she read the name at the bottom, her heart nearly stopped. Ryan Dalton, the billionaire CEO, Noah's father. She stared at the letter in disbelief. He was inviting her to his home. Her first instinct was to refuse. She was just a library assistant, barely getting by. What would she be doing in the mansion of one of the richest men in the country? But then she thought of Noah. If this was about him, she had no choice but to go. The mansion was even more intimidating than she had imagined. As Claire stepped out of the taxi, she was met with towering iron gates, marble columns, and the unmistakable presence of security guards stationed at every entrance. She swallowed hard, resisting the urge to turn back. A butler led her inside, where everything felt too grand, too unreal. The floor was polished to perfection, the chandeliers gleamed, and the silence was deafening. And then, in the center of the room, stood the man she had only seen in newspapers and television interviews. Ryan Dalton. Even in a simple dress shirt with his sleeves rolled up, he exuded authority. His presence was commanding, the kind that made people hesitate before speaking. Claire clenched her hands to hide her nerves. "You're Claire," he said, his voice measured, analyzing. She nodded, standing tall despite the way his gaze unsettled her. "Yes." He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've been spending a lot of time with my son." She braced herself. "Here it comes. The part where he tells me to stay away." "I wanted to thank you," he said instead. Claire blinked. "Thank me?" Ryan nodded. "Noah has been different lately. Happier. And I know you're the reason for it." Claire softened. She had expected coldness, but there was something else in his expression. Something uncertain, almost vulnerable. "You do not have to thank me," she said gently. "Noah is a wonderful kid." Ryan's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. "Most people treat him differently." Claire shook her head. "I did not help him because of who he is. I helped him because everyone deserves a friend." Ryan held her gaze for a long moment. Most people in his world were predictable. They sought wealth, power, and influence. But Claire, she wanted none of those things. And that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. Just then, footsteps echoed from the hall. "Dad!" Noah appeared in his wheelchair, eyes wide with surprise. "Claire!" He wheeled himself forward excitedly. "You're here!" Claire smiled. "I told you I'd always show up, didn't I?" Ryan watched as his son beamed, something he had not seen in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, his world was about to change too. Ryan had always been a man who saw the world in terms of transactions. People wanted things, money, power, status. And in return, they pretended to care. It was a game he had learned to play well. But Claire was different. She did not ask for anything. She did not try to impress him. And yet, somehow, she was changing his world. Ryan found himself watching her more closely, not out of suspicion, but out of curiosity. Every evening, she arrived at the library, her face lighting up the moment she saw Noah. She did not treat him like someone broken. She did not pity him. Instead, she made him laugh, made him feel like he was just another kid who could dream big. Ryan had seen the way his son had been treated before. Most people looked at Noah with either sympathy or discomfort. But Claire? She looked at him like he was limitless. That was what made Ryan pay attention. That was what made him notice her. One evening, Ryan arrived at the library earlier than usual. He stood in the shadows, watching as Claire knelt beside Noah's wheelchair, carefully tying a red ribbon around a book. "This is your adventure book," she said. Noah tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Claire smiled. "Every time something exciting happens, write it down. One day, you'll look back and realize you've had the best adventures ever." Noah ran his fingers over the ribbon, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Even though I can't run or climb?" Claire nodded firmly. "Adventures are not about where your legs can take you. They're about where your heart wants to go." Ryan felt something shift inside him. He had spent so much time building walls, shielding himself from emotions, but watching Claire with his son, he felt those walls start to crack. A week later, Ryan hosted an exclusive charity gala for his company's foundation. The guest list was filled with business elites, socialites, and people who pretended to care about charity just to build their image. Ryan never enjoyed these events, but he knew they were necessary. Claire, on the other hand, had never been to anything so extravagant. She had only come because Noah had asked her to. The moment she stepped inside the grand ballroom, she felt completely out of place. The chandeliers sparkled above her, the scent of expensive perfume filled the air, and every woman in the room was draped in designer gowns. She, however, was just wearing a simple black dress, one she had borrowed from a friend. Noah, sitting beside her in his wheelchair, gave her a reassuring smile. "You look great." She ruffled his hair. "You're the only one who thinks that, kid." She was right. It did not take long for people to notice that she did not belong. A well-dressed woman walked past her, giving her a condescending look. "Who let the staff mingle with the guests?" she whispered loudly to another guest. Claire clenched her fists but said nothing. A man nearby chuckled. "Probably here for a rich boyfriend," he muttered under his breath. That was it. Claire was about to say something, about to remind them that they were standing at a charity event, for God's sake. But before she could, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the air. "She is more valuable than anyone in this room." Silence. Everyone turned to see Ryan Dalton, standing beside her with an expression so cold that the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Claire stared at him, wide-eyed. Ryan continued, his voice calm but sharp. "If you have time to look down on people, perhaps you should also take time to reflect on why your presence here means nothing." The people who had spoken fell silent, shifting uncomfortably. Claire felt her heart pound. Why was he defending her? Ryan turned to her then, his expression softer now. "Come with me." Before she could respond, he gently took her hand and led her toward the balcony. The cool evening air was a relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. Ryan released her hand, looking out at the city skyline. "I do not usually entertain small talk," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. Claire folded her arms. "That makes two of us." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ryan glanced at her. "I should apologize. People like them, they thrive on making others feel small." Claire exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "I am used to it." Ryan's brows furrowed slightly. "You should not have to be." Claire hesitated. She was seeing a different side of him, one that was not cold or distant, one that felt human. "You did not have to defend me back there," she said after a moment. Ryan held her gaze. "Yes, I did." Claire did not know how to respond to that. For a moment, the city lights flickered around them, wrapping them in a quiet kind of intimacy. Then, Ryan spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I will take you home." Claire blinked. "What?" "It is late," he said, "and I do not trust the idea of you going home alone." She raised an eyebrow. "I have been going home alone for years. I will be fine." Ryan sighed. "You are impossible." Despite herself, Claire smiled. "I get that a lot." The car ride was quiet at first. Claire had expected Ryan to drop her off in silence, but instead he spoke. "How did you meet Noah?" Claire glanced at him. "The library. He was struggling to reach a book, so I helped." Ryan hummed, eyes focused on the road. "And after that, you just decided to keep coming back?" Claire shrugged. "He looked lonely." Ryan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Lonely?" That word hit deeper than he expected. Claire continued, unaware of the effect her words had on him. "You know he talks about you a lot." Ryan's jaw clenched. "Does he?" She nodded. "He wishes you spent more time together." Ryan said nothing. Claire studied him for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan glanced at her. "Depends on the question." She smirked. "What made you stop believing in people?" His hands tightened slightly on the wheel. He exhaled. "That is a conversation for another night." Claire did not push. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of who Ryan was beyond the CEO mask. And she was not sure what scared her more, what she had learned about him, or the fact that she wanted to learn even more. Ryan Dalton had spent his life carefully constructing a world where emotions did not interfere with business, neatly organized, controlled, and predictable. But ever since Claire Bennett had stepped into his son's life, and by extension his own, nothing had been predictable anymore. He found himself thinking about her more often than he cared to admit. Not just as Noah's companion, but as someone who had carved a space in his thoughts, and the rest of the world was starting to notice. It started as whispers, subtle glances at charity events, unspoken words exchanged in boardrooms. People were curious. Why was Ryan Dalton, the billionaire media mogul, suddenly interested in a woman so far beneath his world? It did not take long for the rumors to spread. She must be after his money. Another gold digger trying to trap a billionaire. What could someone like her possibly offer him? Ryan overheard these murmurs at an investors' meeting, his grip tightening on his whiskey glass. He had never cared about society's opinions before. He had built his empire without approval, without permission, without compromise. So why did these words feel like an attack? Claire, on the other hand, had already sensed the shift. The once kind smiles of staff in Ryan's mansion had turned into wary glances. The way guests at the Dalton estate suddenly regarded her with veiled amusement or mild disdain. She had never belonged in this world, and she never wanted to. But Noah? He had become her world, which was why, when his birthday came, she could not bear to break his heart. The grand ballroom of the Dalton estate was decorated beautifully, filled with guests who were too rich, too polished, and too unfamiliar. Claire felt out of place but forced herself to smile. For Noah, the little boy had been ecstatic all evening, but when it was time for his wish, he turned to Claire with an expression so serious, it broke her heart. "My only wish is for you to stay in my life forever." The room fell silent. Claire froze. Tears burned at the back of her throat, but before she could even respond, Ryan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Would you ever consider working for me full-time?" Claire's eyes snapped to him. Ryan was watching her carefully, his expression unreadable. She suddenly felt trapped. This was not an innocent question. This was a test. Would she accept his world? His wealth? Would she finally belong? Her heart pounded. She glanced at Noah, at his hopeful eyes. She glanced at Ryan, at the man who was giving her an opportunity she never thought possible. But at what cost? Claire had spent her entire life fighting for her independence, for survival. She had been through foster homes, through rejection, through loneliness so deep it had nearly consumed her. And now, she was being offered a place in Noah and Ryan's lives. But it was not a choice made from love. It was a business offer, a calculated solution to keep her close. And that was why she could not accept. She looked at Noah with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I am so sorry." Then she turned to Ryan and forced herself to say the hardest words of her life. "I am not a part of this life." Ryan stiffened. The room felt suffocating. Claire did not wait for him to respond. She turned and walked away. Noah called after her, his voice breaking. Ryan remained silent, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time in years, he felt something close to fear. Because he knew she was not coming back. Days passed. Noah stopped smiling. He stopped reading. He stopped asking for Claire. Ryan noticed, but he did not know how to fix it. Because the truth was, he was just as lost without her. He sat in his office late at night, staring at his hands, at the empty whiskey glass in front of him. For years, he had believed that money could solve everything. That power gave him control over the world. But none of that mattered now. None of that could bring Claire back. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his assistant. "We found something." Ryan frowned. "What is it?" The assistant hesitated. "It is about Claire." Ryan's heart stopped. He leaned forward. "Tell me." The assistant sighed. She was seen withdrawing all her savings. "It looks like she is leaving the city." Ryan's breath caught. She was leaving. She was actually leaving. And suddenly he could not breathe. She was not just Noah's happiness. She was his too. Ryan slammed his hands on the desk, making a decision that would change everything. He could not let her disappear. Not like this. Not when she was the only thing that ever made him feel alive again. And for the first time in years, Ryan Dalton forgot about logic, about power, about control. Because he had just realized what love truly meant. And he was not going to lose it. Not again. Ryan Dalton had never been a man of emotions. In his world, everything was measured, calculated, and controlled. He built his media empire with sheer determination, ensuring that no one could ever take advantage of him again. Love, emotions, and attachments. Those were distractions, weaknesses he could not afford. But somehow, Claire Bennett had walked right past all his defenses without even trying. She had entered his son's life with nothing but kindness and had unknowingly entered his heart the same way. And now, she was gone. The press conference room was packed, cameras flashing, journalists whispering about what the billionaire CEO was about to announce. They expected another corporate merger or a new business venture. But as Ryan stepped onto the stage, adjusting his tie, his heart pounded for an entirely different reason. He took a deep breath, gripping the podium, and finally spoke. For years, I believed wealth and power were the only things that mattered. That money could fix everything. That control meant security. But I was wrong. The room fell silent. No one had ever heard Ryan Dalton speak like this before. Some people think love is about wealth and status, he continued. But the most valuable person I ever met had none of those things, only kindness. The journalists exchanged confused glances, cameras zooming in as they sensed something far more personal than business. Her name is Claire Bennett. And I love her. Gasps rippled through the room. Ryan Dalton, the ruthless billionaire, was standing before the world, confessing his love for a woman with nothing to her name. But Ryan did not care about the headlines or the stunned faces in front of him. The only thing he cared about was whether Claire was watching. Across town, Claire sat frozen in her tiny apartment, staring at the television screen. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to the man she had tried so hard to forget. She had spent weeks convincing herself that leaving was the right decision, that Ryan's world was too far from hers, that she did not belong. But as she heard the raw emotion in his voice, she realized something else. She had never felt more at home than when she was with him. Her heart pounded as a soft knock sounded on her door. She wiped her tears quickly, opening it to find a small figure standing outside. "Noah?" she whispered. Noah looked up at her with hopeful eyes. "Please come back," he said quietly. "Dad needs you." "I need you." Claire choked on a sob, dropping to her knees as she hugged him tightly. She had convinced herself that leaving would protect them, but it had only left them all heartbroken. With a shaky breath, she pulled back and nodded. "Take me to him." Ryan stood by the fountain in the park, his hands in his pockets, lost in thought. This was where Claire used to bring Noah, where she read him stories and helped him believe he could be a hero. Now, he was the one hoping for a miracle. He heard footsteps behind him, and his breath caught. He turned slowly. Claire stood a few feet away, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The world seemed to pause. Then, Claire took a shaky step forward. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that I would never fit into your world." Ryan exhaled, stepping closer. "You were never supposed to fit into my world," he said gently. "You were supposed to change it." Claire let out a small, broken laugh, shaking her head. "But what if I fail?" Ryan's gaze softened. "Then we fail together." A tear slipped down her cheek. She had spent her entire life searching for a place where she belonged. And somehow, it had been right in front of her all along. Ryan reached out, brushing his fingers against her cheek. "You are my home, Claire." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and whispered, "Then let's not waste another second." Ryan cupped her face, tilting her chin up as he pressed his forehead to hers. He had spent so long believing love was not meant for him. But now, holding Claire, he realized how wrong he had been. Love was not a distraction. It was not a weakness. It was the only thing that truly mattered. The wedding was small and intimate, just the way Claire wanted it. No extravagant decorations, no elite guest lists, just love. Noah stood proudly as the ring bearer, beaming as Ryan and Claire exchanged vows under twinkling lights. When Ryan kissed his bride, it was not just a celebration of love. It was a promise that she would never be alone again. Ryan never forgot what Claire had taught him. He stepped away from ruthless business ventures, focusing instead on making a real difference. He founded a charity for children with disabilities, inspired by Noah's journey. And in Claire's honor, he donated millions to children's hospitals and libraries, ensuring that no child ever felt alone in the world. Years later, Claire and Ryan sat on the porch of their countryside home, watching Noah run across the grass. The sun was setting, bathing the sky in soft orange and pink hues. Ryan glanced at Claire, his fingers lacing through hers. "Still afraid?" he asked playfully. She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Not anymore." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ryan pressed a kiss to her forehead, holding her close. Love was never about finding someone who fit your world. It was about finding the person who made your world worth living in. And for Ryan, that person had always been Claire. She was just a janitor, invisible to the world, until one night, she found a little girl crying alone, her tiny hands clutching a torn drawing of a happy family she never had. Without knowing who she was, the janitor knelt beside her, offering comfort with a simple act of kindness. But what she did not realize was that this girl was the daughter of the city's most powerful billionaire, and that one small moment would change all their lives forever. Because soon, the man who owned everything would fall for the woman who had nothing. Emma Carter wiped the sweat from her brow as she finished mopping the marble floor of Sinclair Towers, one of the most prestigious corporate buildings in the city. It was nearly midnight, and while the rest of the world had gone home, she remained, quietly working in the background, ensuring that every surface sparkled before the next workday began. She had been a janitor here for 3 years, long enough to know that people in this building never truly saw her. To them, she was just another part of the cleaning staff, unimportant, invisible. That was fine with her. She was not here for recognition. She was here for a paycheck, for stability, for her younger brother, Jacob, who was counting on her to pay for his university tuition. Emma never minded hard work. What she did mind was the loneliness that sometimes crept in, the feeling that she was only existing, not really living. But she shook that thought away as she wrung out the mop. Life had taught her that there was no room for self-pity. She had a job to do, and she was grateful for it. As she carried her cleaning supplies toward the back entrance of the building, she heard a quiet sniffle. Frowning, she slowed her steps and glanced around. The office had long since emptied, and most of the lights were dimmed. But as she reached the indoor garden, she saw a small figure curled up on one of the benches, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A little girl. Emma hesitated for a moment, glancing around to see if someone else was nearby. Maybe a parent or a nanny. But the girl was alone, her tiny hands gripping a crumpled piece of paper as she cried into her knees. Something in Emma's chest tightened. She knew that feeling, the kind of sadness that sat heavy in your bones, making you feel like no one in the world truly cared. She set her supplies down and slowly approached. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly. "Are you okay?" The little girl startled, lifting her head abruptly. Tear-streaked cheeks and big, glassy blue eyes met Emma's concerned gaze. For a moment, the girl said nothing. She just stared at Emma, clearly surprised that someone had spoken to her. Then, with a shaky voice, she whispered, "My dad canceled our trip." Again, Emma's heart sank. She had seen kids cry before. Jacob had cried when their mother left, and she had held him just like this. But something about this little girl's heartbreak felt deeper, like she had been carrying this pain for a long time. Emma sat down beside her on the bench, careful to keep some space so she would not scare her off. "That must be really disappointing," she said gently. The girl sniffled, nodding. "He always says he's too busy with work, but he promised this time." Emma exhaled slowly. She did not know who this little girl was or why she was alone in a corporate building late at night, but she could see that her sadness was real. "Sometimes, grown-ups get caught up in things they think are important," Emma said. "But that does not mean they do not love you." The girl twisted the crumpled paper in her hands. "Then why does it feel like he doesn't?" Emma did not have an answer for that. She wanted to say something comforting, but she also did not believe in lying. So instead, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small square of paper, and began folding. The girl watched, confused, as Emma's fingers moved with practiced ease, creasing the edges carefully. Within seconds, the paper took shape, a delicate little origami flower. Emma smiled and held it out. "This is for you." The girl hesitated before taking it. "What is it?" "A promise," Emma said. "Even when things feel lonely, you are not alone. Someone out there cares about you, even if it is just a janitor like me." The girl clutched the flower tightly. For the first time, a small smile tugged at her lips. "What is your name?" Emma asked. "Lily," the girl said quietly. "That is a beautiful name," Emma replied warmly. "I'm Emma. And you know what, Lily? You are stronger than you think." Lily nodded slowly, wiping her tears with the back of her sleeve. "Thank you, Emma." It was a simple moment, just a fleeting act of kindness between a janitor and a little girl. Emma did not think much of it. She just wanted to comfort someone who seemed lost, the way she wished someone had comforted her when she was younger. What she did not know was that their entire interaction had been captured by the building's security cameras, and that someone was watching. Miles above them, on the top floor of Sinclair Towers, Richard Sinclair sat in his dimly lit office, his gaze locked on the security footage playing on the screen in front of him. He had not meant to watch it. His security team sent him reports daily, and he usually skimmed through them without much thought. But tonight, something made him pause. His daughter, Lily, sitting alone in the garden, crying. He had failed her again. He clenched his jaw, guilt coiling in his chest. He had promised her they would take a weekend trip, just the two of them. But work had gotten in the way. Meetings, deals, responsibilities. He always thought she would understand. But watching her on the screen, looking so small and heartbroken, made something inside him ache. Then, the janitor appeared. He had seen her before, cleaning the halls at night when he worked late. She was just part of the background, someone he never paid attention to. But tonight, as he watched her kneel beside Lily, saw the way she gently comforted his daughter, something about her caught his attention. She did not speak to Lily with empty platitudes. She did not rush her or try to distract her with false reassurances. She just listened. And then she gave her that flower. Richard leaned forward, staring at the screen as Lily's tear-streaked face slowly softened into a smile. Something about that moment unsettled him. Who was this woman? And why did she care? Most people in his world were after something: money, power, influence. No one did anything without an agenda. But the janitor, she had no reason to be kind to Lily. Yet she had been. Richard turned off the footage and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Curiosity. He had never thought much about the people who worked in his building. The janitors, the servers, the assistants. They were just there, doing their jobs, invisible. But now, he could not get one of them out of his mind. Emma Carter. And he had a feeling that this would not be the last time he heard that name. Emma wiped the last traces of dust from the windowsill, sighing as she straightened up. Another long shift, another night of quiet labor while the wealthy occupants of Sinclair Towers carried on with their luxurious lives. She was used to it by now, being invisible, overlooked, just another part of the background. But lately her nights have changed. Lily, the little girl, had become a part of her routine, sneaking away from her lessons and security guards just to spend time with Emma. It had started small, just quick chats while Emma cleaned. But now it has become something more. Every evening, Lily would find her, sitting on a stool in the corner of a hallway, watching as Emma worked. She would ask questions, tell Emma about her day, and sometimes, just sit quietly as Emma listened. Emma never asked about Lily's background, never pried. She treated her like any other child, talking about silly things, teaching her how to fold more origami flowers, and sharing little stories from her own childhood. "You don't act like the adults I know," Lily said one evening, twirling a pencil between her fingers. Emma chuckled, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn stain on the marble floor. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "A good thing," Lily said quickly. "Most grown-ups talk to me like I'm a baby, or like I don't matter. But you actually listen?" Emma paused, glancing at the little girl. The loneliness in her voice was unmistakable, and it made Emma's heart ache. "That's because you do matter," Emma said softly. "And sometimes, it helps to have someone who understands." Lily's eyes lit up. "You understand me?" Emma nodded. "I wasn't always a janitor. I was a little girl once, too. And I know what it's like to feel invisible." For the first time, Lily smiled. A real, genuine smile that made Emma's heart squeeze. But what Emma did not know was that someone else had started noticing too. Richard Sinclair leaned back in his leather chair, watching the security footage playing on his screen. It had become a habit now, checking in on Lily when he was too busy to see her in person. It was not ideal, but it was the best he could do. What he had not expected was to see his daughter sneaking away every night to talk to a janitor, Emma Carter. He had watched their conversations unfold in silence, observing how his usually withdrawn daughter opened up to this woman. Most employees in his company would have tried to take advantage of the situation, used Lily's affection to ask for favors or demand a raise. But Emma never did. Instead, she treated Lily with a kindness that was rare and genuine. Richard did not trust people easily. Over the years, he had built walls around himself, shutting out anything that felt too personal. But something about this janitor unsettled him. Why did she care? Why did she spend her time talking to Lily when she could have just ignored her? He needed to find out. The opportunity came sooner than expected. One evening, as Emma was carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies through the hallway, she collided with someone coming around the corner. She gasped, stepping back immediately. "I'm so sorry." Her voice trailed off as she met the piercing blue eyes of a man she had only seen in pictures, Richard Sinclair. She had spent years cleaning his building, walking past his framed portraits in the hallways. The powerful CEO, the man who built an empire with nothing but his intelligence and drive, the man who never smiled. Now, he was standing in front of her, his sharp gaze assessing her in a way that made her skin prickle. Emma quickly lowered her head. "I'll be on my way, sir." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You spend a lot of time with my daughter." Emma stiffened, so he knew. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "I didn't mean to overstep, sir. Lily she needed someone to talk to." "I never intended. Did I say I had a problem with it?" Emma hesitated, glancing back at him. His expression was unreadable. "You didn't," she admitted carefully. Richard folded his arms. "Then why do you look the handle of her bucket tighter?" "Because I know how this looks. I know people like me aren't supposed to get involved with people like you. But I wasn't trying to gain anything, Mr. Sinclair. Lily, she's a wonderful child. I just wanted her to have someone to talk to." Richard studied her for a long moment. She did not ask for favors. She did not beg for recognition. Instead, she spoke about Lily with nothing but sincerity. For the first time in years, Richard found himself at a loss for words. Without another word, he nodded and walked away, leaving Emma standing there, heart pounding. What had just happened? The secret did not last long. One afternoon, as Emma was kneeling on the floor, scrubbing at a scuff mark near the entrance of the building, she felt a familiar presence beside her. "Lily." She grinned. "You're back early today." Lily nodded excitedly, holding out another origami flower she had folded herself. "I made this for you." Emma took it carefully, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "It's beautiful. Can I help you clean?" Lily asked eagerly. Emma chuckled. "I don't think your father would approve." "My father doesn't care what I do," Lily muttered, rolling her eyes. A deep voice interrupted them. "Is that so?" Emma's breath caught. Slowly, she turned, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw Richard standing just a few feet away. Lily paled. "Dad." Emma quickly stood, smoothing her uniform. "Mr. Sinclair, But Richard was not looking at her. His eyes were on his daughter, filled with an expression that Emma could not quite place. "You think I don't care?" he asked Lily, his voice quieter than before. Lily bit her lip, suddenly looking unsure. "You're always busy," she said softly. "You never have time." Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Lily." Emma held her breath, sensing the tension between father and daughter. For the first time, Richard Sinclair, the powerful, untouchable CEO, looked almost human. Lily turned to Emma for reassurance, but Emma stayed silent. This was something they needed to figure out on their own. Richard finally looked at Emma. "You've spent more time with my daughter than I have in months," he said, his voice unreadable. "What do you think?" Emma hesitated. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but she also knew what Lily needed to hear. "I think," Emma said carefully, "that she's a wonderful child, and I hope you spend more time with her." For a moment, Richard just stared at her. Then, to her utter shock, his lips quivered in the faintest hint of a smile. And Emma knew in that moment that everything had changed. Emma walked through the grand gates of the Sinclair estate with hesitation weighing her steps. The mansion was nothing like the modest apartment she shared with her younger brother. It was a world she had never stepped into before, a world where wealth dripped from every corner, where chandeliers sparkled brighter than the stars, and where people like her did not belong. Yet here she was, because of Lily. Richard had personally invited her to dinner after Lily had insisted that all she wanted for her birthday was to spend time with Emma. When Richard had asked his daughter what gift she wanted, he had expected her to say a rare doll, an expensive trip, or a designer dress. But instead, she had simply said, "I just want to have dinner with Emma." The response had shocked him, making him realize just how deeply his daughter had bonded with the kind janitor. And so, against his own reservations, Richard had extended the invitation. Now, Emma stood at the entrance of the grand dining hall, feeling completely out of place. Lily ran up to her, taking her hand excitedly. "You came. I thought you would change your mind." Emma smiled at her, pushing aside her nerves. "I almost did. But how could I say no to you?" Richard watched the exchange in silence. His usual cold demeanor had softened ever so slightly, but his piercing eyes still held curiosity. "Emma, please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the long dining table. Emma hesitated before sitting at the farthest chair from Richard, and Emma's eyes widened at the extravagant spread. She was used to simple meals, nothing like the fine dining set before her. Richard, noticing her hesitation, cleared his throat. "It is just food, Emma. You do not have to be formal." Lily grinned. Just eat however you like. That is what I do." Emma let out a small chuckle, relaxing slightly. "All right, but do not blame me if I embarrass myself." Lily giggled, while Richard's lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. As dinner progressed, the conversation shifted. "You have been working at my company for how long?" Richard asked, his tone neutral. 3 years, Emma replied, cutting a small piece of her meal. "I started right after my mother passed away." Richard's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I am sorry for your loss." Emma nodded. "Thank you. But I had to be strong for my younger brother. He was still in school at the time." "Do you support him?" Richard asked, curiosity in his voice. Emma smiled softly. "Yes. He is studying to be an engineer. It is not easy, but I would do anything to make sure he has a good life." Richard studied her, surprised by her selflessness. Most people in his world were out for themselves, yet Emma worked tirelessly for someone else's future without complaint. "You are very different from the people I usually meet," Richard admitted. Emma let out a small laugh. "That is probably because I am nothing like the people in your world."